From the darkest reaches of space to the deepest corners of your mind. Welcome to From the Void.
Welcome to From the Void. I'm your host, John Williamson, and I'm back with the second part of my interview with author-researcher Doug Kari. And we talk all about his book, Berman Murders, Unraveling the Mojave Desert's Most Mysterious Unsolved Crime. We wrap it up this week, and we will be back next week with an all-new mystery. But until then, enjoy Part 2, The Berman Murders, the Mojave Desert's Most Mysterious Unsolved Crime on this week's episode of From the Void. Yeah, and in your investigation, what's interesting is that, it's not a situation where if indeed he did it, he never paid the price necessarily for that crime, but you uncover the fact that he's got quite the history, because one of the things that, would be interesting to look at would be, did he have any other telltale signs, any red flags that would indicate that he had sort of the disposition to pull off a crime like this? And then you start to find out that there's some interesting background to him in regards to some time he spent overseas. So talk about what you found out there and what led you to believe it. Yeah, this is definitely a guy who has the ability to pull this off.
Well, he had a troubled relationship with women. That was clear from the work that investigators did. But we really learned more about all of that later on, because after I started investigating the case in 2014, when it had gnawed on me for so many years, I thought, I want to just find out what happened there. And I started digging in. One thing led to another. My first story on the case was a cover story for LA Weekly, and it attracted a lot of attention. And because I got involved and the sheriff's office decided to cooperate with me, they also decided to assign a homicide investigator to actually do a homicide report and see if they could close up this case. And that was in parallel to what I was doing. After my LA Weekly article came out, some information emerged from jailhouse informants, including the cellmate of the chief suspect, because it turns out that after he retired from the Marine Corps, he's now a middle-aged man. He has a pension. He's a retired Marine Corps officer. He has education. What does he do with his life? He goes to Cambodia, which has a reputation as kind of a lawless country, particularly regarding matters of child sex. And he rents this upscale villa and sets up shop with trafficking in little girls. I mean, I'm talking 9 to 12-year-old tiny little children. And he is having them live in his house, and he's taking care of them and sending them to school. But the price they have to pay is to be under his domination and control. And he's doing horrific things to these children. He's tying them up, raping them, beating them, gagging them, leaving them bleeding. I mean, this isn't some, sick pedophile who thinks he's in love with a child. This is a guy who's purposefully trying to dominate, injure, and control and violate children. And it makes you wonder, did that kind of propensity just suddenly start to happen in midlife? Or is this a continuation, perhaps, of behavior that's been there all along, or desires that have been there all along? And it dovetails with what law enforcement thought right away, that there was some sexual motivation involved in whatever happened to the Bermans. This certainly seems to fit that. And you think about the handcuff key, and it starts to make sense. Maybe he saw an opportunity to just kidnap these people and have his way with them and then slay them. Or maybe he made some inappropriate proposition and that led to violence. We don't know. But what we do know is there are only a few people out there And we've got one person who has now proven to be a violent, sexual sadist capable of the most horrific kinds of crimes. It would tend to indicate that he should be looked at very, very hard as a potential suspect.
So you mentioned that, he does eventually end up in jail, which is where he sort of starts to confess. And you mentioned that part of the reason that perhaps he starts to confess within prison is that, people who are viewed as like pedophiles are pretty low on the food chain and really looked down on even within prison. And so maybe as a safety mechanism almost to ensure his own safety, he starts to brag about the murders. And so you mentioned some of the things that he did mention, it seems, to his cellmate seemed to be things that weren't out in the public. And so like only things that only perhaps the killer himself would know. Are you aware of some of the things that may have like really sort of pinned this case on him?
Well, I did correspond by email and spoke by phone with his cellmate and with another inmate who said that they had heard him bragging about these killings. And it's a tough one to evaluate. I never met them in person, and they would have possible reasons for wanting to lie. For example, they might be trying to get credit for some of their time, or perhaps, revenge. Maybe they had it in for the guy in some manner. But the investigator who at that point was assigned to the case did meet with them in person, and his take was that they were serious people who had believable reasons for talking because, as you indicated, it's a terrible thing to go through prison under any circumstances. But of course, there is a social hierarchy in prison. A bank robber, somebody doing something that is kind of cinematic, is going to be regarded much more highly than somebody who preys on little children. In fact, if somebody who preys on little children could genuinely have their life in peril in many prisons in the U.S., not so much in the federal system where he was, but certainly in state systems. But even in the prison system, you're going to be looked down upon as the lowest of the low. And so to elevate his status and gain respect, it's very plausible that he did that he did brag about the killings. And the accounts that were given by these prisoners revealed some details that were not in my LA Weekly article. That was the article at that time that laid out the facts of the case. I didn't talk about the fact that if you go from where the Bermans camped up this rugged road for about 2 miles, you come to some natural hot springs. But that's one of the things that, according to these prisoners, he talked about, and that he talked about also that Louise was wearing some little gold, he called them bangles, little things around her neck. Well, I never talked about the jewelry she wore, but it is true that she had a pair of little dangly necklaces. And they offered details that sounded, quite plausible. And is it possible somebody made good guesses and, that these fellows in prison in Texas somehow, in Arizona, somehow came up with this out of the blue? Maybe. But it's also plausible that indeed Michael Pepe bragged about this in an effort to elevate his jailhouse status.
Yeah, and he, as I kind of alluded to earlier, he didn't necessarily, this crime is still technically unsolved, and so if in fact he did do it, he didn't pay for this particular crime, but he does end up in prison, and it almost gets thrown out, and you just think, gosh, like, is justice ever going to be served here? But he does end up in prison and gets quite a long sentence. But talk about sort of the sort of back and forth where you're like, gosh, is this guy going to actually pay for anything he's done? Because they've, without a shadow of a doubt, proven what he's done to these children, right? So that's without question.
There's no doubt that he committed the most horrific behavior against the children. Not only did they testify twice because he won a retrial, not only did they testify twice, there was all this corroborating evidence, the most damning of which was hundreds and hundreds of naked photos of these girls in his bedroom, including some that he had tried to delete that computer forensics experts in the U.S. Embassy were able to recover. You know, if you don't overwrite data, it's not really deleted. And they were able to recover photos showing him naked with one of the girls. And then the girls were very, very clear in their testimony. He tried to claim that they had somehow been manipulated, but they came to court both as little girls and then later as young women who had been adopted by American families and spoke English. And their stories were just very clear about what he did and exactly how it came down. And then there was evidence in his house that supported their allegations, like the ropes that he tied them up with and the children's toys. I mean, he had them living in a bedroom right down the hall from this massage room. And he even wrote a letter home where he kind of admitted some of these details. So the fact he committed these horrors against children would be very hard for anybody to dispute. I mean, the evidence is to a dead certainty. However, there's technicalities involved because this happened overseas. And normally, things that happen overseas aren't the business of the United States government. But when an American travels overseas or goes overseas, for certain kinds of heinous purposes, one of which would be to engage in these kinds of sex crimes with children. The U.S. government has several statutes in place that will respond in that kind of, and cover that kind of an incident. And so he was prosecuted, brought back to the United States and prosecuted under those statutes. But I mean, it was just this up and down of different courtroom dramas. And as I mentioned, the case got reversed on appeal at one point, and then it went back. He got convicted again. But I have to tell you, even today, he's still seeking Supreme Court review. There's still a chance that this thing could take another turn again. I mean, John, this is the craziest story. We're talking decades have gone by, and there's still no closure here.
And we're talking about a story that's almost 40 years old at this point. And so not only are there not a lot of firsthand, witnesses left, there's some of the law enforcement even that worked on the case, but he's got to be getting up there in age as well. And so, what other things have they looked into around him? Because it seems to me that what we know of folks who commit these types of crimes is that typically, the first one's kind of rushed and hurried and they make mistakes. And then, as they commit additional murders down the road, they sort of perfect it. And clearly when they found the bodies, someone did a fairly decent job of hiding them. So is there anything to indicate that maybe perhaps he had murdered before, at least within the U.S.?
There's no indication that he had committed either these kinds of child sex crimes or any other crimes up until the time that the Bermans are murdered. And again, he's never been charged in that, but there's all this circumstantial evidence, including his own inconsistent stories that points towards him. And of course, now what we know about is violent propensities. After the Bermans were killed, and before he goes to Cambodia, there's a period of time where we just don't know. We don't know if he was just living an upstanding life or whether he was engaging in deviant behavior. We do know that during that time period, he married yet again. It was his third time, to a much younger woman from Russia, an immigrant. He brought her over on a fiancé visa. And we know she fled the marriage very quickly. And I was told by his own family that she did so because he was deviant and he was hurting her in bed. So we know that much.
Wow, that's kind of terrifying to think that there may be other unsolved crimes connected to him out there. One of the other questions I had for you is based on one of the things you mentioned too, is sort of how they were able to tie the crimes back to him, the more recent ones that happened in Cambodia, through searching through his hard drives and stuff like that. So one of the things that came to mind is obviously a crime that occurred so many decades ago. Technology has evolved significantly since then. Is there any hope that with the remains, that they're able to run any sort of test that might tie it back to him?
It would be very difficult. From the research I've done, and I didn't do extensive research in this area, but I did enough research to determine that it's highly unlikely that if he had, for example, shed a piece of skin or something like that. Let's assume that he was involved in the murders and that he was burying the remains. We'll assume that, even though he's never been charged, because I do believe the evidence points that direction. So if he's out there engaged in this all-day activity, nowadays, if the bodies had been found quickly, DNA evidence could likely be found. There'd probably be some skin, maybe some hair. But remember, Marines wear their hair short, so it'd probably be a pretty small piece of hair. Now, there was a lot of material gathered up when the bodies were exhumed from this grave. And there was all kinds of debris and things, and presumably that material still exists. I did ask the Inyo County Sheriff's Office if they would review all that, because I do believe that if there are hair follicles in there, there's a possibility that testable amounts of DNA could be recovered. However, they never got back to me on it. I doubt that it's happened, and I'll be the first to admit it would be a needle in a haystack. Nonetheless, why not give it a go?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I really appreciate your time today. This is an absolutely fascinating story, heartbreaking in many ways, especially for the family who remain. Tell folks a little bit about where they can keep up with what you're up to, and also get a copy of the book.
So the book is The Berman Murders. I have a copy here. And it's published by Rowman & Littlefield, a very respected publisher. I was really fortunate to have them back the project. And I have a website, a Facebook page, and I'm on Instagram. So the website is Doug Kari, and it's Doug Kari. It's a Finnish name. So just DougKari.com. And then at Doug Kari Author on Instagram, and Doug Kari Author on Facebook. You can find me there. There's lots of material about the cases I've worked on, links to articles, that kind of thing, John.
Well, again, fascinating book. I highly encourage folks, especially if you're a lover of true crime. This is a truly fascinating mystery. The Berman Murders: Unraveling the Mojave Desert's Most Mysterious Unsolved Crime by Doug Kari. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you. I appreciate it, John. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to From the Void. If you enjoyed this or any prior episode, please consider rating, reviewing, and sharing with a friend. We'll be back next week with an all-new mystery. And until then, you've been listening to From the Void.